So it's about time. Want to give Levi all the time he needs, but we leave the doors open in case more people want to come in. Yeah, it's my great pleasure to introduce Levi Cruz to you. He works with the Translation Association of the Philippines. He's in the Subanen language translation team, working with them, doing research. He did his master's degree here in Chiang Mai at Payap University. Yeah, and that's probably all for now we need to know about him. He will tell us about biblical names and tools he developed about it. So he's also technically minded. We'll hear about that. So I hand it over to Levi.
Okay. So good morning. My name is again Levi Cruz, and this morning I will be talking about transliteration of proper names in the Bible. So to start, I'll give a bit of a background and explain what this study aims to do. Biblical names make up a large part of a translator's task, and the challenge of rendering them goes all the way back to ancient times. In the Philippine context, translators work with different spelling traditions, Spanish, English, and local forms, but there are no clear or unified guidelines to follow. This study looks at how biblical names have been transliterated in Philippine Bible translations and propose practical guidelines that balance fidelity, readability, and cultural familiarity. Although this study focuses on the Philippine context, the principles and recommendation it offers can also benefit other multilingual settings with similar translation challenges. Let's look deeper into the issues surrounding the transliteration of biblical proper names. As Hermanson points out, this issue continues to trouble translators today. And in many translation projects, proper names receive little focused attention, often copied directly from the reference version without careful review. Training programs also seldom address how to handle names, leaving translators and consultants uncertain or unprepared when deciding on the most appropriate forms. These issues have clear consequences in the target language. Many proper names remain unadjusted for readability, which can create barriers for semi-fluent readers. And when adjustments are made, they're often ad hoc without clear principles guiding them. Phonological and spelling mismatches can make some names confusing or even difficult to read. Inconsistencies in the intermediary languages, whether Spanish or English, also get carried over into the translation. Even familiar names may be treated differently from lesser known ones, making consistency even harder to maintain. This study has three main objectives. First, to examine how biblical names have been transliterated across different Philippine Bible translations. Secondly, to identify the historical and linguistic patterns that shape those forms. And third, to propose guidelines that promote consistency, fidelity, and readability. It's important to note that this study does not deal with the question of whether names should be translated or transliterated, which is a separate issue. To understand how the problem began, we turn to the historical foundation of translating biblical names. Two key references guide this discussion. One is Fernandez Marcos' study on proper names in the Septuagint, which show how ancient translators approached Hebrew names in Greek, and Jože Krašovetz's work, which traces how those forms continued to transform across later translation traditions. So Marcos' study focuses on how the translators of the Septuagint handled Hebrew proper names, which is for him one of the most challenging areas in Bible translation. He points out that proper names are primarily deictic, which is they identify people and places rather than describe them. Yet many Hebrew names also carry meaning, often tied to events or divine acts. This dual nature of names, both being identifiers and meaningful words, force the translators to decide whether to preserve the form or translate the meaning in each case. He describes a continuum of translation strategies used in the Septuagint. Some names were simply transcribed, retaining their Hebrew form. Others were phonetically adapted to fit Greek sounds and morphology. And in some cases, the translators chose to render the meaning instead. But there was no consistent approach. Translators oscillated between fidelity and adaptation, often making decisions based on context. Some names were modernized, meaning they are replaced with something that's already familiar to the Greek audience or left in their original form. Krashovet's work offers a comprehensive historical and linguistic overview of how biblical names evolved across time. He traces the progression from Hebrew and Aramaic through the Greek Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate into later European languages. His study shows how linguistic systems, cultural traditions, and even religious attitudes influence the way names were shaped. Over time, translators gradually moved toward greater transliteration and standardization, a trend that continues in modern versions today. Another key insight is that original biblical texts tend to preserve name forms with a fairly high degree of stability. But once translation began, first in the Septuagint and later in the Vulgate, multiple forms of the same name often appeared. The LXX translators didn't follow a strict system for transliteration, but instead they adapted Hebrew names to fit Greek sound patterns or even popular interpretations. These inconsistencies were carried forward into the medieval European translations, where translators often followed inherited Greek or Latinized forms. In contrast, modern translations place greater emphasis on consistency, guided by closer attention to the Hebrew and Greek originals. So having looked at the historical background of how biblical names were handled in earlier traditions, let's now turn to the data for this study, how these patterns appear in Philippine Bible translations. The dataset include 450 names selected through a stratified randomized sampling from more than 3,000 names found in the Bible. And these names cover Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin origins drawn from both the Old and New Testament. The analysis draws from 17 Philippine Bible translations and 7 intermediary versions representing 6 Philippine languages, Tagalog, Cebuano, Ilocano, which are major Philippine languages, Ibaloy, Eastern Tauwid, and Matigsalog, minority languages, and 2 intermediary languages, English and Spanish. So this chart shows the chronological distribution of the Philippine Bible versions, included in this study. The timeline begins with the earliest translations in the early 1900s and extends to the most recent editions published between 2010 and 2024. Each cluster of versions reflects changes not only in translation practice but also in linguistic influence. Biblical names in earlier translations were heavily influenced by the available Spanish versions, while some were influenced by English versions such as the KJV. These intermediary versions served as models for most Philippine translations. The variation you see across the timeline corresponds closely to 2 major historical contexts. The Spanish period and the American period, where reforms in the Spanish and Tagalog orthography took place, explaining why transliterations differ so noticeably across Philippine Bible versions. So in this study, I compared each Philippine name form with its counterparts in the Spanish and English versions. Each name was then classified according to which source tradition it followed more closely. I also identified common spelling substitutions, noted sound changes and that reflect local pronunciation, and observed inconsistency within each language translation. So this slide shows a portion of the database of proper names used for analysis. Each column here represents one Bible version, both intermediary and Philippine translation. while each row shows the corresponding form of a particular name across versions. Altogether, the database contains 450 names systematically compared across 24 versions. This side-by-side format makes it possible to trace spelling variations and identify inconsistent patterns and detect shifts in transliteration from one translation tradition to another. So here's a closer look of some words compared. Okay. So for the findings and analysis, the first and most noticeable pattern I found is that Philippine Bible translations differ depending on the language basis of the transliteration or pronunciation. The first category is what I call Spanish-based transliteration. These are name forms that follow Spanish spelling and pronunciation, sometimes with slight local modifications. So as you can see in the fourth column, many of the Philippine forms are either identical to or only slightly adapted from their Spanish equivalent. So you can see the Spanish forms in the second column and the target language transliteration on the fourth column. So you can either see identical forms or slightly modified. The second category is what I call English-based transliteration. These are name forms that follow English spelling or pronunciation, sometimes with slight local modifications. As you can see in the third column, most of the Philippine forms mirror the English ones, some exactly and others with small adjustments that reflect local orthography or sound patterns. The third category is identical in both. These are names where there's no difference between the Spanish and English forms. So the Philippine translation simply retained the same spelling. So example of this is Ahava, Babel, Abraham, Ono, and Israel. So they're the same in both English and Spanish and in the target language. The last category is what I call unclear or hybrid forms. These are names that show features of both Spanish and English, making it difficult to tell which language they were based on. For example, we see in the first row, Rafa, spelled with the PH and ending with H in English, and Rafa using F. So the Tagalog form combines these features. So I couldn't tell whether it was based in English or in Spanish. The same with Anaya and Zipporah, Hoshaya, and Gileadite. Okay, so this graph plots the number of English-based proper names found in major Philippine Bible translations from 1905 to 2024. Each bar represents one Bible version and shows how many of its name forms follow the English tradition. As you can see, the earliest translations in the early 1900s contain very few English-based names. Most were and most were still Spanish-based. Out of 450 names, only less than 20 English-based proper names were found. Moving forward in time, especially after the 20th, after the mid-20th century, the number of English-based forms rises sharply. By the 2000s and beyond, English has clearly become a big influence as translators increasingly align their spelling and pronunciation with English versions. Moving to minority languages, this graph focuses on 3 minority language translations, Ibaloy, Taubuid, and Matigsalog, and shows how many of their proper names follow English-based forms. As we see here, the Ibaloy translation has the highest number, followed by Taubuid and then Matigsalog. This suggests that smaller or more recent translation projects also tend to follow the broader national trend, adopting English-based spellings, likely through the influence of English source versions and consultant input. Now let's look more closely at how those forms were actually adapted. That is, what kind of spelling changes translators made within each language tradition. In major languages, Tagalog, Cebuano, and Ilocano, we see a strong resistance to change. These translations tend to preserve traditional Spanish spelling, keeping letters C, Z, J, for example. In fact, orthographic reforms affected ordinary words much earlier than proper names. In contrast, minority language translations like Ibaloy, Taubuid, and Matigsalog show much greater localization. Translators often adapt the names to fit local sound patterns, replacing foreign letters. In these languages, proper names are treated similarly to ordinary words and naturally adjusted to local spelling system. After examining the variations in transliteration strategies across time, languages, and Bible versions, this study identified 7 key factors that explain the motivations behind these differences in rendering biblical proper names. These are some of the key factors that influence how proper names are transliterated in Bible translation. Translation philosophy, orthography, language-based preference, established usage, reference versions, extra biblical usage, and readability. So for translation philosophy, particularly the choice between foreignization and localization. This concerns whether the translation team prefers to preserve the foreign appearance of biblical names or adapt them to local spelling conventions. Second is the orthographic system of the language, since some letters or letter combinations used in the source simply don't exist in the target language. The third is the language-based preference, whether translators lean towards Spanish-based or English-based forms, especially for names that are less familiar to readers. Fourth, some names have become established through popular usage, like Nebuchadnezzar or Ruth, which are now hard to change. Fifth, translators often follow reference versions, usually the national or regional language Bibles, since readers expect the names to match what they already know. Six, there's the influence of extra biblical usage. Names like Jesus, Italia, or España that have already been standardized in non-biblical contexts. And finally, readability also plays a role. Some borrowed forms may be technically accurate but difficult for readers to pronounce or recognize, prompting translators to simplify them for clarity. Now let's go to the practical application. From my analysis of the 450 names, I will propose some tools that will help in decision making of the translation team. So the first tool I propose is the questionnaire for transliteration decisions, which is based on the 7 key factors identified in this study. That influence how biblical proper names are rendered. This questionnaire guides translation teams in deciding how to spell and adapt biblical proper names. It helps them discuss key issues and agree on consistent principles to follow throughout the translation. The second tool is the Biblical Names Transliteration Matrix. It's a comparative reference similar to what I showed the spreadsheet I showed. It's a comparative reference designed to help translators make consistent and informed decisions about proper names by showing how each name appears across source, intermediary, and different relevant Bible versions. It allows teams to see historical patterns, compare spellings, and make balanced choices that preserve both faithfulness and readability. So you can view both tools through these QR codes. I'd be very happy to hear your feedback and suggestions or ideas for improving them further. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Levi. We have plenty of time to bring our questions to Levi. So I invite you to come up here and bring comments, questions, complaints, whatever you have, bring it up to him. Keep the ball rolling. I have a question for you. Is there any correlation between the faith of the translation? So let's say you have a Catholic translation, would that tend to be Spanish? And if it's Protestant, it would tend to be English spelling?
I think most the Bibles I consulted were mostly Protestant Bibles from Bible Society. So I wasn't now able to analyze Catholic editions.
So can you please come up here, because we need to get your voice also for the Zoom attendance.
Okay. Greetings. I'm Hervé Foto from Cameroon, and I'm a Bible translation consultant. Thank you for your presentation. And the topic is transliteration of how do you say, proper names?
Yes.
Yeah. So this topic is interesting for us. It might seem not interesting. Yesterday I was before yesterday or yesterday I was talking with my roommate. We were talking about names. It's true you're tackling the transliterations specifically of biblical names, but I'm not sure it's outside of the scope of your work. Maybe it's a way for you to broaden it or to think about it more. For example, my roommate is coming from a culture where names have a meaning. And I know in the Old Testament, many names actually have a meaning. And I come from Africa, and it's true in my culture sometimes. Names are a means of remembering things and actually carry meaning. So I'm just wondering, do you think transliteration, I know that's what we've been doing. And as a consultant, that's what I've been doing. And I remember once in a team, somebody asked me, can we actually, well, like Peter, in the Greek is Petros. So their mother tongue, they have a way to say, like if you say a rock, you say ngok. If it's a human being, you call him ngoke. So he was wondering, should we keep a transliteration of Peter in the mother tongue? So I said no. So at the end, we adopted that. But it's resounding, like coming into my mind too. So what do you think about not only depending on transliteration? Do you think translation is able to capture all these semantic value of names that you have, like, for example, in the Old Testament specifically? I'm not sure about the New Testament. So why would you say, after going through all of this, thinking about transliteration as a way of rendering biblical names in your context?
Thank you. So I think that's an interesting topic to discuss. I would like to venture on that study, specifically knowing when name forms are used for deictic purposes, for just referring to people or place, or when it is which names function as with meaning to not only to refer to a person or place, but it has a meaning function to emphasize the meaning of the name. So I would like to, I think that would be a next step for that, to identify those functions, and then you can decide whether to transliterate or translate the meaning of the name.
Yes, please.
In your research, did you include a method like asking the translation team why they decided to choose this method of spelling, and include that in your list of reasons why? Because I saw your list a while ago. It could be due to orthography or even, yes, colonization when we were under Spain or the US. Like, we're friends with the Philippine Bible Society. You could just ask their translation manager why he decided some of their spelling system, if they have one.
Yes, that's one gap in probably a gap in my study, that I was not able to ask the
Because
translators.
they're still alive.
Yeah.
We can ask them.
Although I asked one translator of a minority language, but she said, I asked how she came up with those quote unquote inconsistencies, because I noticed, why did you translate it like this while I see same context, different spelling. And she said she didn't have a specific system that she followed. She was rushed into transliterate the names towards the end of the project. So before publishing, that's really what prompted me to conduct this study, because many translators, I think, are do not have a system of transliterating. But yes, I'd like to ask the Bible Society, what systems do they use?
Yeah, if there is.
Mm.
Yeah, maybe you also want to explore those motivations, since we can actually ask them if the translator is still alive. And
Mhm.
I remember one in the motivation why they spelled a proper name in the Bukidnon Old Testament translation, where they opted to revise the spelling of root. Of course, the English spelling was RUTH, but they want to localize it to, because they don't have the TH sound in their local phonology. T,
RUT.
so they just spell RUT because they think that's a proper localization. But then in the end, they created another problem. A family named their child Ruth, spelled with that from the Bible, their local Bible, RUT, and the teacher said to the girl that that's a wrong spelling. So from then on, she puts RUTH. So the Bible was wrong spelling. And then when she grew up, that girl had encountered a bigger problem when she applied for her passport. Now you have RUTH, but in her birth certificate, it's RUT. So now we have a Bible that created a problem. I mean, a spelling of a proper name. That's interesting. Maybe that's not widespread, but you may be, I, there may be other reasons to create,
Actually,
add in your
in
list.
the early translations of major biblical major translations, RUT was more common. It's only 1980s beyond that they changed to RUTH. So probably, if I'm guessing, because the name, the anglicized Ruth is already popular during that time, so that's why maybe they adjusted it.
Yes, please come back. Yeah, we still have more time, so you can. Yep, yep.
2 minutes back with another question. So thank you. Also, I saw the list of the list you gave about the how do you the what influences the there was a the one. Yes. Okay. Orthography. Okay. So I'm just wondering, there are some, like in my mother tongue, when the subject carries a tone that shows it's actually grammatical. So I'm just wondering if among the factors, I don't know how Filipino, how do you call it, in Philippine languages function. Have you encountered in places where the transliteration is affected by morphosyntactic reasons? I guess that if you have a language like, you know, Greek, which is case marked, then if you're transliterating and you're using in a text, depending on the case, you need to develop a way to change the nouns, the transliteration according to the function of probably the noun in the sentence. So have you encountered places where you have linguistic factors or even yes, morphosyntactics influences on the transliteration?
Yes, there are examples, but not because of the case. One example is for names of people coming from a certain place, like from Rome, or we will say Taga. In some languages, it will be, in northern languages, it will be just E. So from Rome, it's from Romans will be E Roma. I'm not sure if that's, yeah. And that would, that's interesting because the I will be sometimes non-capitalized and then the place name will be capitalized. So that's the most common morphosyntactic syntactic reasons or influence.
Okay, we are almost there. One final question from me, just because I'm interested. Does it ever happen that a name gets changed in the translation because the way as it stands would have a very bad meaning in the language?
I think many translators. Personally, I did not see in my 450 names list, but do you have examples? I did not see.
Doesn't come up here, so don't have to answer that here. I want to encourage you. You can still engage with Levi on the app, ask more questions, and also remember those QR codes. You may want to look at his tools. And then we thank Levi again. Let's give him a hand.